Hi, I'm Judy Liebo. I am a fiber artist, or in other words, I'm a quilter. I've been quilting for about 30 some years. I started when I moved to Oregon. I was not a quilter, I was a crafter. I did crocheting, macrameing, beading, kind of cross stitch, you name it, I did it, but I did not quilt. I had a friend who invited me to go to Sisters, Oregon. And that was when they were having 3 days of classes and then the quilt show. My question to her was, what do you do with your kids? I had 3 kids in elementary school. She said, you leave them at home with your husband. I started quilting that year. And I have been quilting ever since. And I've gone to Sisters almost every year since too. As a quilter, I tend not to follow any patterns. I tend to make up my own designs. And when you look around any place around in your environment, you will see a quilt. You'll see it in the tiles in the floor, you'll see it on the leaves in the trees, you'll see it in water rippling, and so it's really easy to come up with ideas. The hard part is how to implement them in fabric. And so I will come up with some idea, I'll mull it over, and I have a design board that I will start putting pieces up or putting design ideas up. Sometimes it goes really quickly depending on how inspired I am. Sometimes it takes a while for me to make it work. In the macaw morphing, you will see 4 different versions of the macaw. One is circles, one is linear pieces of fabric, one is something called a log cabin, which are a technique that quilters use, and one is collage. The collage technique is the one that looks most realistic. It's made up of hundreds and hundreds of tiny little pieces that are cut out of fabric, glued down, sewn over, until you end up with the image that you have envisioned. And for me, it was a macaw. And I wanted to show different versions of it just to give you an idea of how you can take the same image and change it. So, a quilt can be done in 2 weeks, or it can take me 2 months. The most misunderstood thing about quilters is that we're little old ladies sitting in rocking chairs with our needle in hand. I rarely do that. I tend to not do traditional quilts, so you will almost never see the patterned quilt that you envision in your mind. Even the ones that are traditional, such as my flamingo, which is a traditional English paper pieced pattern, which normally comes out looking like a flower garden. It's called Grandmother's Flower Garden. Instead, mine ended up being a flamingo because doesn't everybody want a flamingo hanging on their wall? So, I think the thing that I find that people are most surprised about is when they look at the quilts, they go, oh, I had no idea you could do that with fabric. Okay, Mr. Piano Man came out of an art gallery in New Orleans. Jamie Hayes, who is now deceased, had this wonderful sense of humor in his art. And I was in his gallery and buying a book, and I happened to mention to the clerk who was checking me out that these would make such great quilts. And he said, well, do it. And I said, no, they're copyrighted, I can't do it. And he goes, I'm his manager. I give you permission, make one. So I started with what I thought was a Jamie Hayes idea, and it morphed and morphed. It sat on my design wall for weeks, having me wonder how I was going to put it together. When it was finished and I looked back at the book, I realized that the only thing about that quilt that is Jamie Hayes is the piano mouth. Otherwise, it was my creation, but inspired by Jamie Hayes. So a tribute to Aunt Lois was based on an old beat-up quilt that my Aunt Lois gave to me. My Aunt Lois is the oldest of my dad's siblings. There were 2 girls and 3 boys. She had this quilt, and she was an impeccable crafter, and she did such beautiful handwork. She had this quilt that had 49 of those little floral wreaths on a quilt. But the quilt itself was in shambles. She was in a wheelchair, and she'd gotten it caught multiple times in her wheels. The batting had disintegrated, so there was no batting. The fabric was so thin that you could see your hand through it. So I did something that quilters never do, but I ripped it apart. I cut out all the wreaths, ripped everything apart, and I made 4 identical quilts to give to the families of her siblings. You know, the iris, which looks like a series of lines and color blobs, is really a picture, and you'll see in the picture next to it, it's a picture of an iris. The photo was gridded, and the grids went in multiple directions, and then all you did was sew strips in the color placement on that photo. So when you first look at it, it just looks like blobs of colors until you look at the photo next to it, and then you say, oh, that is an iris there. I see the whole thing now. So that's kind of the fun part about doing abstract art. And that one, I think, is easy for people to recognize when you see the photo next to the quilt. It's a good learning tool for people to be able to look at abstract art and recognize what the artist is trying to do. So that's a really interesting question, because I think art gives us our humanity, that you can go about your daily tasks in a very robotic fashion, and you can get from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 without art. But if you want joy, peace, beauty, any of the things that make you feel good, you need to have some type of art. It may not be art that you like, that I like, that you may not like, but to every person there is something that appeals to their sense of beauty. And I think that makes us more human. Well, you know, my poor husband, he has lost bedrooms to sewing rooms. So, you know, I have to give him credit for allowing me to take over rooms of the house with my quilting. And hours of the day that I spend in my sewing room quilting. I have a lot of good friends that quilt with me. And so, you know, we form this little posse of old lady quilters that meet on a regular basis, and without them, it wouldn't be nearly as much fun. We recently moved, and so I have a new cadre of friends, of which Betty, who helped me hang my quilts, was one of them. And it's just so nice to be able to show the world that, you know, this is an art form that anybody can take up, and that anybody can express how they feel. Just beauty in the everyday things that you see.